Susie and Richard, and thank you everyone for coming today. It's nice to see friendly faces in the room. So for those of you who know me, you know that this work is deeply personal for me. So what that comes with is a lot of angst and anxiety and preparation and stress and joy in the midst of it all, because it means that much for me. It's a burden I carry, but it's a burden I carry with gratitude, because I feel that I have been gifted with some unique experiences that give me some insight. And so with that, I am always excited to be able to share with you kind of my experience, my perspective, and to just advance the dialogue. And so I see this as an opportunity for us as a community, us as a family, to engage around some sometimes challenging issues. And I recognize that as such. And so as we dive in today, I'm just inviting you to a conversation and inviting you to an opportunity to grow together, to lift each other up, to be committed in prayer as we seek wisdom moving forward in this work. I don't think any of us have it figured out. And so I think if we come to this work with humility, come to it with openness, I think that we can really take some strides forward. And so I actually titled this presentation today, What Sneetches Can Teach Us About Everyday Racism. And I'll be honest, the reason I started out with something sort of lighthearted was because I don't particularly like delving into these difficult topics. What was placed on my heart was to talk about issues of privilege and power and whiteness, and that can bring some feelings, it can bring some emotions. And so this is my Sneetch, and this is my shoehorn. So we're going to go into some difficult, uncomfortable places, and I'm hoping that we can just be reminded to kind of keep some lightheartedness in the process, laugh at ourselves when we make mistakes, and just be reminded that we're all in this together. And so just a little bit, I wanted to introduce this topic with this story. Dr. Seuss, we know him as sort of the wonderful child author, and I don't know how many of us really look at his work more deeply, but he actually has a mixed record when it comes to issues of race and diversity. And early in his career, he did drawings for publications, various magazines, college publications, and he actually presented certain groups in very stereotypical ways. And it wasn't until after World War II, where some of his commissioned work brought him to Japan, and he saw the devastation that was brought upon that country by the atomic drop by his own country, that he started to really rethink and really change his perspectives. And so his writing after World War II, you'll actually see a shift. And many of his stories actually have themes underlying them, addressing issues of racism and discrimination. And this book is one of those. He starts out, and this is sort of just the first paragraph of the book. Now, the star-belly Sneetches had bellies of stars. The plain-belly Sneetches had none upon bars. Those stars weren't so big, they were really so small, you might think such a thing wouldn't matter at all. And when I think about this, I mean, it could apply to so many different contexts, but certainly when we think about this construct of race, really shouldn't matter at all. We know it does. We know that within the context of our history and in our society, it has meaning and impact and differential outcomes. But I think that, as he goes through this story in this book, he talks about these Sneetches, these yellow bird-like creatures, and the ones with the stars would snub their noses at the ones without. They would keep them out of the playful activities. And you see this pattern of sort of creating the other, and the construction of difference, and what that means in terms of our lived experiences. And so I wanted to just use that as a way for us to enter this conversation. And I'm going to take some time to really talk about what we're going to go through today, what our goal is, and I want to frame it in a very specific context. So we're going to talk about these concepts of power, privilege, and whiteness. And I'm going to use vegan sociologist. He talked about this notion of racial framing. So we're going to use that to better understand how these concepts operate. And then I'd like for us to explore elements of framing and counter-framing in the context of diversity matters. We're going to have a table activity a little bit later on. We're going to actually practice that. And then I'd like to close out by drawing on some biblical principles for how we move forward in this work. So that's the outline. This is the goal. Okay, so this is really the scripture that I would say guides my own Christian walk and that guides my work in diversity matters. So it's from 2 Corinthians 5:16 and 21. So from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And so under tables, you're going to see a bookmark that I usually give out at these events because it has a cross on it, and on the other side there's a quote that I'll talk about in a little bit. But that cross for me is that symbol of reconciliation, of Jesus making it possible for us to be reconciled to God and for us to be reconciled to each other. It represents for me the hope of vertical and horizontal reconciliation. And I also understand it to mean that reconciliation is a journey. It's our journey toward God, and it should compel us towards each other and to be able to see a common humanity in each other. So while this work is difficult, why I am hopeful in it is that I feel the cross has already sort of given us a pattern and a way forward. And so it's a model for us in this diversity journey. As we think about the spiritual process of salvation, I see some similarities. So just as the invitation to salvation necessitates that we address those areas of sin and woundedness and brokenness that keep us separated from God, I believe that living in a community of difference also demands that we address those areas of woundedness in ourselves. I believe that just as reconciliation to Christ necessitates that we enter upon the creation story, so too our reconciliation to each other demands that we engage honestly with and understand the places where our narratives intersect. Similarly, just as the salvation journey to salvation requires God's grace, I believe that our diversity journey necessitates forgiveness in quite the same way. And so each act of forgiveness moves us closer, not only in the direction of God's love, but also closer to the kingdom intent for diversity. And so everything that we talk about today is really in this spirit. This is our calling. This is what we have committed to as a community of believers, and we have a way forward. So here are the ground rules. So I would love to be able to say that the ground rules are going to be that this is going to be a safe environment, that everything you say, we're going to just all understand, and this will just be a really easy experience. I can't say that. And so I start out instead with the quote that's on your bookmarks. And Paul Tripp is a pastor, speaker, author, and he's talking about this in the context of our walk with God, that we're not to be alone, that it's really a matter of community. But I think it has relevance to the work of diversity. And he says, I move toward you not because I trust you, I move toward you knowing that we are both broken and that this is potentially messy. I move toward you because I trust the cross of the Lord Jesus Christ and there is hope for us. And so this is our why. This is why we do this. This is why we engage in difficult conversations. We don't expect it to be easy, but we know that there's a way. And how do we do it? So this quote comes from Professor Volmink. Had the opportunity in May to go to South Africa with several others from APU, and we met with this wonderful higher education expert who I just wanted to sit and copy every word he said. But this was, I think, verbatim what he said. When engaging people with different worldviews, you have to take the time to hear the logic of the narrative of the other person. And what I really believe in this work, we're not always going to agree, and we may not always arrive at the same point, but I think we can certainly minimize a lot of conflict and hurt if we can reach this point where we can at least listen long enough to be able to hear the logic of the other person's narrative and where they're coming from. And so these for me are sort of our operating principles as we go through today's discussion, our why and our how. So I'm going to ask you to take out your cell phones. I'm assuming everyone has cell phones. And it's going to take a minute for it to come up. There's a delay as I switch over to another screen for, okay, so if you've used the poll everywhere, the question that I'm asking is for you to, in 2 or 3 words, describe what comes to mind when you hear white privilege. Where you're going to text it, you're going to text to 37607, and what you're texting right now is Sandra Richard 607, just to get into the poll. Is that clear?
So we type in
once you type in Sandra Richard 607 to 37607, then you're in, and then you can just go ahead and type your response. It should work. Anyone in yet? Okay. You can just go ahead and type in your response. So in 2 or 3 words, describe what comes to mind when you hear white privilege. And I don't want you to overthink. It's just sort of what your immediate response is, a thought, a feeling. So the size of the word shows you its frequency. Sort of settled on some of these.
Says it's no longer acceptable.
So I just want to take a minute to just kind of see what's here with us. Okay, we're not going to go through all of this, but just some of the words that are standing out. Power, unbalanced, history, male, white, denial, arrogance, Trump, blindness, ignorance, weeping, unaware, sadness, freedom, reality, rewards, money. Okay. So there are a lot of different responses, a lot of different understandings of the concept. I think there's some common themes up there. But I kind of just wanted to put this up here and just take a second to kind of take a look at what's here. This is what's operating in the room as we go through this discussion. So we're going to go through I'm going to go through the definitions that I'm actually going to use as sort of our operational definitions for today. So Alan Johnson, who's one of the foremost authorities on the topic of power, privilege, and difference, sociologist, he defines privilege as this. To have privilege is to be allowed to move through your life without being marked in ways that identify you as outsider, as exceptional or other, to be excluded or to be included, but always with conditions. Just give you a minute to digest that. I want to talk a little bit more about the elements of privilege. So what are we talking about when we're really talking about privilege? Wildman and Davis identify three elements associated with privilege. First is defining. So those who have privilege, they can define the societal norms. They can define standards of beauty, what's acceptable, what counts as intelligence, what counts as knowledge, counts as valid, how we look at political decisions, how we look at economic structures. So these are part of our history. This is part of what's rooted and embedded in the very structure of society. The second element is choice. Privileged group members can rely on their privilege and avoid objecting to oppression. So many times, members of marginalized groups, members of historically underrepresented groups will speak out on different issues, or they will feel a need to have different acts of protest that may not always be understood by majority culture, but it's coming from positionality, experience in the world, not having choice to sit without acting, without speaking up against oppressive acts. Third element is invisibility. So privilege is really seen by those who have it, which makes this really difficult to tackle. Because how do you engage in something, how do you talk about something that can't be seen? And then how do you move towards, not to really give up necessarily privilege. Privilege is something that we all have in different realms. The idea is to then use that privilege to ensure that everyone can have opportunities at the same level. So privilege and power, I don't know that we can talk about them in isolation. I feel that these need to be looked at in conjunction. So they're sort of like, if you think about a coin, two sides of a coin, they're one constituent element. You really can't pull one apart from the other. And so all social reality is defined, and power comes from the ability to control the definitions of situations. This is the definition from Rosado, and you can see how privilege, looking back at our definition, and power really work together. talk about white versus whiteness, because I think when we talk about whiteness, there's this notion that we are attacking or singling out white people. And I just want to make clear that white is a category of race, it's a social construct. We're talking about it at an individual level. When we're talking about whiteness, we're talking structural. We're talking about a dominant cultural space. So it's not attached to an individual, it's about a cultural space that has been defined within our history at a time when, so white didn't exist always. Okay, so it evolved in the New World, in the colonies as Europeans were coming to America. And really, it was designed specifically to classify people, to maintain control over African slaves. And at the time, poor white indentured servants were actually building alliances and relationships with African slaves. And whites started to get nervous about their own ability to control. And so white was created as a political construct and used as sort of an organizing tool to unite Europeans so that they could have strength in numbers and increase the ability to control and maintain dominance over Native Americans, over African slaves. And so the very construct of whiteness is based on exclusion and racial subjugation. So in that existence, we're talking about cultural space, a place of power, a place of privilege. Even though slavery was emancipated, even though there have been changes, that does not mean that this has been disrupted. It means that we live with the remnants of that. We live with the legacy of that. And so our focus in this conversation, in this context of privilege and power, we're really focusing on whiteness, that social location, not white. So, sorry. There was an audio to it, but it is not playing. So, from very early on, as we watched Sesame Street as kids, we're sort of socialized to kind of identify difference, and not in a way that draws us closer to each other. It's really to identify which one of these things does not belong. And I just wonder if we shifted, our perspective, we shifted the way that we approach difference. How would it challenge us to embrace and to go towards the thing that's different, to not look at it as something to identify, classify, and then place on the margin? And so I think that it's really important for us to understand that when we're talking about power, privilege, and whiteness, we're really talking about the social construction of difference. We're talking about othering. We're talking about creating a structure where we know there's going to be a balance. So this is why we need to address these concepts. So there's a lot here on this slide, but it really talks a little bit more about what whiteness really is. So whiteness is not just about skin color, it's an ideology based on beliefs, values, behaviors, habits, and attitudes, which result in an unequal distribution of power and privilege based on skin color. It represents a position of power such that those who own it can define the categories. It's fluid. Who is included in that category of white changes? We look at the census over the decades, we know that it's not a stable, constant factor. It's relational. White only exists in relation and opposition to other categories and locations in the racial hierarchy. It's often a state of unconsciousness, that whiteness is often invisible to white people, and this perpetuates sort of a lack of understanding and knowledge about differences in how they operate in our social relations. It shapes how white people view themselves. It also shapes how members of non-dominant groups view themselves as well. And cultural, so when we think about what racism is, cultural racism is founded in the belief that whiteness is considered to be the universal and allows one to think and speak as if whiteness describes and defines the world. So I know these concepts can be a little bit difficult to unpack. I'm going to show a clip in a little bit that's going to kind of give us a historical example of sort of how cultural racism operates. Now, before I get to that, I just want to move on to our third concept of our fourth one, racial frames. So this is sort of a key piece of what I hope that we'll take away today, is that as we're looking at these concepts, I think that Fegan offers a helpful way of sort of organizing them and helping us to understand sort of how they're deeply embedded. And so he talks about racial framing and this idea of dominant racial frames that sort of become the master narratives that operate in society. And so these are the underlying concepts and values that are deeply rooted in our story as a nation. They shape the ideas, attitudes, and beliefs that we share collectively, and they evoke certain standards, values, and morals that are reinforced and continued throughout society over time. Fegan explains that frames are based on and largely reflect the way that we see even things like nationhood and citizenship. Shapes the way that we understand our Western Christianity, such that we see political positions then become tied to faith. And it's related to perceptions and interpretations of right and wrong, good and bad, defining beauty and intelligence. It's in every aspect of our social relations. So this idea of framing and what sort of gets set as true, factual, as representative of reality is not always the case. And so how do we even begin to wrestle with that? How do we even begin to reframe? How do we become aware enough to know that we need to reframe? And that's part of kind of what we're doing here today. And so we're going to jump into an activity at your tables in just a little bit. But I wanted to go a little bit more into this idea of framing. And so most of kind of the values that we sort of operate under are within this dominant frame. And those aren't bad things. Our interpretation sometimes, the way in which we then use those to set policies and practices, the way in which we respond to each other across differences, sometimes those aren't played out well. And so just being aware that this is who we are. This is kind of the set of values and systems that define us as a nation. I wonder what it would look like if we considered other frames. If we started to practice that reframing. And so when I look at dominant frames, for instance, so I do think we often operate from a dangerous world frame. We're seeing that play out in our world today. And so we need to build a wall. Okay, well, where does that really come from? Where do those ideologies come from? And we'll have differences of opinion on that. But I think just understanding that that's rooted in sort of a set of values and a history, how we define ourselves, how we define boundaries. Geographic boundaries are actually quite an interesting thing. They're not often a spatial reality. It's sort of something we impose, and then we function as though it's reality. And so, now what would it be if we actually came from a framework of a global family, a linked faith? When we think about law and order, I think we all want law and order. We think those are good things. You know, how has that value played out in our history? So at what points do we see greater motivation to impose law and order? When we look at our national history, we know that after the emancipation of slavery, we have now had heightened fear. Now what's going to happen? The social order is disrupted. We see lynchings. Okay? We know that after the civil rights movement, we saw mass incarceration go up. There's a social order that's disrupted. Our sense of norm, our sense of what is stability is challenged. Does it really reflect a reality of increased crime? That's for us to investigate further. It's for us to be aware of and to really kind of trace our history and practices and how dominant frame values, while not bad in and of themselves, can sometimes be played out in ways that are harmful to non-dominant groups. And so I just present this as an option, as another way of viewing. It's a lens. It's a lens that we can use to make decisions. It's a lens that we can use to make policies. It's a lens that we can use to guide our interactions in community. So the previous slide and this slide are going to be needed for the table talks, but I want to talk a little bit about elements of framing. So when we're talking about framing situations in society, when we look at media, news coverage, these questions become important to ask ourselves. So what are those master narratives? What are those frames? What are those value sets? What are sort of the underlying concepts that are deeply rooted in our history that are being told? Who's the storyteller? Who has the power to shape the narrative? What values are being highlighted? And if we were to take the chance and take the risk of maybe looking through an alternate frame, what might that look like? So I am going to ask you to please, I know this is very controversial. I think that we can do it here. I think we can't do it here. We're in trouble when we go out there. So I'm taking the risk and putting this out there and asking you to really engage in some meaningful conversations around the table. We don't have to agree. Remember, that's not our goal. Our goal is to hear the logic of the narrative of the other person. And I hope that you will feel free and courageous enough to enter on this conversation. What I want you to do is to spend a good amount of time at your tables really talking about what you see in the image, what is the role of race in that image, how you feel that story might be told from a dominant frame, and what it might look like from a racial equity frame. The sad part about all of this for me in terms of dominant frames and how they operate is just how much we've missed of the richness of who we are. That to me is the loss and the reason to really want to begin to understand how to reframe, at least to be able to identify the dominant frames that are operating and then be able to reframe. So I know people are going to have to start leaving, so I'm going to kind of go through the rest of the slides here. So how do we begin to address power and privilege? How do we begin to kind of tackle this issue? Recognize what dominant frames are operating. Not always easy to do, because if they just are natural to us and it's part of our understanding of history, I don't think we can do number one until we do number two. I would say we need to do better at practicing compassionate listening with the purpose of reducing suffering, to really consider another's narrative, to understand what alternative frames might be at play, in just about every situation and context. I would say number three, take the risk of not understanding and sit in the discomfort of dissonance. We're all in higher education. Learning is uncomfortable. And so I think this just is part of what we do, and it needs to be part of our practice in terms of diversity work. To take the risk of not understanding. I may not know where you're coming from, I might not understand your reasoning, I might not understand the narrative, but I'm going to listen. Always with that ear towards, what can I hear to begin to reduce the suffering that I'm hearing from voices that may not have the same life experiences that I have. And commit to taking action. Speak up, speak out, reconsider social realities through a racial equity frame, and help to reframe inaccurate and oppressive narratives. That one's that last one. I think we all have to be sort of the authors and creators of new narratives that more accurately reflect the experiences of the whole of God's creation. So I wanted to also just leave some principles that I think are biblically rooted and that can really provide some direction for us. So I think we're called to be seekers of truth as Christians. And I think we do this by inviting the Holy Spirit, by praying earnestly to gain insight. We're not going to be able to solve this in our own power. This is too deeply embedded. This is too much a part of who we are and how we understand the world, to be able to think that somehow in our own abilities that we can just overcome racism. It won't happen. And so I believe this is a spiritual battle. I believe that this requires divine intervention, and if we are not intentional about that, I think we're not going to see any movement forward. So I just call each one of us to just become students of racial understanding. Read, read, read. Gain a more accurate interpretive framing of U.S. history. That's where it begins. I think until we rewrite and really understand how deeply embedded these issues are, I don't know that there is hope. Practice the spiritual discipline of remembering. Remembering is part of what we do as Christians. We're called in the sacrament, whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. That's what we do. I think remembering is an important part of our walk. I think it's an important part of our efforts to address issues of racism. And I say here, remember in order to remember. We are a broken body. We're separated from each other. In order to restore wholeness, we need to engage more authentically and fully with our nation's narrative and to really understand its current day impact. And I would say recognize that words matter. We shape and continue to frame and feed into dominant narratives with much of the language that's sort of just common day and without questioning it. And I think that we can really make a huge change if we practice anti-oppressive language. So that's my own political stance. No one has to agree with it, but it's just an example of how we do that. I personally don't think a person can be illegal, and I love the quote from Elie Wiesel. He says there, so in conclusion, I would just say that difference is something for us to embrace. It's something for us to want to move towards, but it's important for us to understand how difference has been constructed within a social hierarchy and what that means for everyday impact for people. And so the quote from Alan Johnson, who I used earlier in the slides, the trouble that surrounds difference is really about privilege and power. The existence of privilege and the lopsided distribution of power that keeps it going. The trouble is rooted in a legacy we all inherited, and while we're here, it belongs to us. It isn't our fault, but now that it's ours, it's up to us to decide how we're going to deal with it before we pass it along to generations to come. This is our collective responsibility, and it's something that we can move forward with joyfully, knowing that the victory's already been won. That cross is our symbol and representation of how we do that work. And so I'm grateful for you and for this community that we can have these conversations and that we can take steps forward to be that change.
We would just like to thank Sandy. We know how much time and how much heart she put into this presentation. She will be here. We know a lot of you have classes to teach, meetings that you're late to. She'll be here for questions. For those of you who want to stay, if you have a class tonight, you want to grab a sandwich to take with you, please feel free. And just to let you know, We need God with us in this journey, but we also need our colleagues. So if you want to become part of a network, raise your hand if you're a diversity ambassador. I know about 3 of them have left. Okay, look around the room. This is a wonderful network, and that's really what it is. We give you 6 trainings in fall or spring. We have some slots for the spring open. You can call me, you can email me, and I'll give you information about it so that you have someone there to encourage you, to push you also, and to support you in your work. Thank you, and let's give her one more round. And if you need to leave, we understand as well.